Good morning, folks. Just a little morning walk and talk. I was out looking at hackberry and looking to see if there's any berries on it. It does produce an edible berry. It's sweet, and the Native Americans in the area used it in pemmican. And I don't see any. I see one dried up berry. Let's see if you can see it behind my hand, right there. The berries are usually red. And I don't see that this one has any. I've got 3 or 4 of them, 4 hackberries over here. But while I'm over here, I'm noticing that as I'm staring up at my trees and look down, I'm noticing that the elms had decided to drop their seeds. Let me see, got it here. There you go. You see all these little green dots on the ground? Those are elm seeds. Why am I showing you elm seeds? I'll explain in a second. And I'm also observing all the mushrooms coming up over the last several days. It's just been tons of little mushrooms. They're not as many today. That little white dot there. Lots of little mushrooms coming up, different colors. And this time of the year in fall, in my native space, a couple of my garden beds have them. Why am I showing you that? Well, to show you one of the benefits of having an area that you basically don't manage, and say don't manage in air quotes, even though I don't really use air quotes, because I do manage it. I remove native species, but I don't really do anything else. I make paths in here so I can get in and remove the non-native species, the invasive species that come in and remove them. So it's somewhat managed. Even Mother Nature itself struggles. Sorry for the car in the background, but it is a suburban neighborhood. But even Mother Nature itself struggles with permaculture. Isn't that sad? It struggles to maintain its permaculture system. So the human has to come in and clean up the mess of the other humans, to keep the invasives out. But once you do that, you get this seasonal example, at least in my area. I see these seeds drops. I know that I've got a very short amount of time before I better get the last things in the ground for fall. So by having a native space like this, I don't need a planting calendar. In the spring, when I see Foresteria pubescens, the elbow bush, when I see it blooming, I know I got a couple weeks tops. I need to get everything in the ground or I'm going to run out of time. There's other indicator species in here. You see certain things growing, and it will tell you what's going on in your soil if you have enough fertility. Just based on the types of native plants that will arise in that soil, will tell you you don't need a soil test if you know your native plants. So there's that benefit. As a seed bank, especially if you live in an area where there's a lot of native foods that are human edible, like say in the tropics, subtropics, even the Great Plains, you'll get free seeds, free crops sprouting up without having to do really hardly any maintenance other than removing non-native species. Then there's benefits to wildlife. If you enjoy watching wildlife, I have flocks of dove that come and nest in this area, so many that they will weigh down the power lines roosting. So, and I've had foxes in this yard, not resident, but I have had armadillos resident and cottontail rabbits, and depending on how you look at it, that may be something that you consider a benefit. I mean, if anything, if you're not into raising livestock, it can provide, if you're a meat eater, an emergency source of food, and all those little critters that make your garden home. And I know that may seem harsh for some folks that aren't meat eaters, but it's just a reality that, it is a food source if you need it. So keep that in mind. There's benefits to that. So, and having all those critters coming into your garden, they are seed dispersers. So they're part of the vector that brings in free plants for your seed bank if you are into native seeds. So there's that benefit. But to the permaculture practitioner, to me, one of the biggest benefits is an example of what you're supposed to be doing. And that brings up a question: how permanent is your permaculture? And how permanent should it be? It's a good follow-up question. And before I get into that, I'm going to walk you down to that area there. We're going to look this direction because I have a little treat for you guys. Well, I think it may be a little treat. It's a treat for me, so maybe you'll like it. I've, a year ago, I bought some land that will expand this yard. And I want to give you all a sneak peek because this fall and winter I'll be working on it, starting to clear it out and get it ready for cultivation, for permaculture conversion. So, I'll let y'all take a look. If you're willing to sit here and listen to me rant, then you deserve a first peek into this. All right, I just want to make sure I don't step in the cactus. I have cactus all over the property, native, and it does provide fruit and food, so it's great for permaculture in this area. There you go. There you go, folks. Lots of privet over there. Hope you can see it with the sun. I won't know until I get into the editing. But there you go. 100 feet that direction in a 100 foot by 100 foot square. And the entire space is dedicated to growing things, to a permaculture conversion. So I have like 2 permaculture projects, really. I have existing forest that's having food forest elements added. And then I have a lawn, traditional lawn that's being converted. So hopefully y'all will enjoy it when I film that over there. But back to that, how permanent is your permaculture? How permanent should it be? Well, there's the culture part of permaculture you can't ignore. It's supposed to be horticulture. It's supposed to be growing food for humans to reduce how much space, or at least better use the space that we humans use to grow our food, to where it's less impactful on the environment. That gets into questions on what's the goal of permaculture, what's the definition of permaculture, and some might say it's well-defined, some disagree. But I think we all agree that the inspiration for permaculture are these native systems. So how permanent should your permaculture be? Well, you need culture. You need that horticulture. So any human edible, we humans, we travel all over the world. We've collected all the species we like to eat. We can't necessarily live completely off the local ecosystem with the amount of land we have available. What does that mean? Okay, so native peoples lived in this area. They lived off this land exclusively, off the natives in this land. They didn't bring invasives in like when the Europeans came to grow and to make their food. But when they lived like that, at least in this area, their diet would be comprised of 80% meat. And the land area they needed to get all the edibles, wild edibles that they needed to eat was much larger than we can spare today. If we try to feed all the humans that we need to feed using that method, we would need more land than we really have. So you have to increase the carrying capacity. If your permaculture system does not increase the carrying capacity of the land, carrying capacity in wildlife terms is like how many animals, how many species can this land support? The carrying capacity for grizzly, say in Yellowstone. When I'm talking carrying capacity, I'm talking about the carrying capacity of the land to carry a human, to support a human. And funny I mentioned grizzlies. To support a human is around the same amount of calories as you need for, like a black bear. Our brains, consume a lot of calories, and generally speaking, that's about how much food we need. So if you look at wildlife, if you look at native species and the land, the permanent landscape in like my area where it's more arid, how many bears it can hold per acre is a decent indicator of how many humans it could hold per acre growing only native species. Okay, having basically the true permanent part of your permaculture would be to have something that looks like this. It's all native, and you live off what is all natural and native, right? But you're going to need more land in this area. So, and I think that's been fairly conclusively proven. They're like, oh wait, if we add earthworks and swales and capture more water and maybe give artificial advantage to the species that we can eat, say instead of ash juniper, we replace that with these deciduous plum trees and maybe some vines and stuff that are, it's artificial, but at least everything in it is native. It's just the numbers of each species is overrepresented to benefit humans. Okay, fair enough. You could do that, and that would increase the carrying capacity of the native land. To what extent, I don't think anybody's done that experiment to be able to say. So maybe they have, but that's what I'm trying to do here, essentially, is to try to stay as native as possible. And you notice I have a few non-natives, and a lot of those are really just for fun, just because I like peaches, for instance, or because I like figs, and they don't go invasive, so I grow a few of them. But for the most part, I'm trying to take the approach of just sticking with the native species and filling those out to maximum capacity before I go adding any non-native species. But that's going to reduce how much carrying capacity this land has for humans doing it that way. It simply will. It's just, if I mow all of this down and start doing like market garden style farming, I'm probably going to produce more than what I'm doing right now. Now, the promise of permaculture, I've heard, is that it can produce just as much. But from what I've seen in the studies is that it won't produce just as much of a singular crop. It will produce just as much in terms of poundage of food, but you're going to be eating non-traditional crops. You won't get as large a yield of any singular crop because you polyculture whenever you do this farming method. But in terms of overall poundage of food yielded per year, it is about on par with so-called traditional farming styles. So that's the promise. So one goal, how permanent it should be, well, if you're not hitting that level of production where you're able to get at least close to what a so-called traditional farm can do, then you have to question whether or not your adherence to the permanence side of it is hindering your ability to produce. It is a balance. Permaculture is trying to find this perfect balance, and as far as I'm aware, I don't know if it's necessarily been found. But what I will say is that a lot of people think that it's impossible, that permaculture, and I did at first, that permaculture it's just not going to. You're never going to be able to find that artificial, human edible ecosystem that is in perfect balance with all of the native stuff around it. And not only does it not impact anything, but it actually increases. Now, there are studies that show that certain human activities actually do increase wildlife and diversity of species. And permaculture does tend to look like it definitely does. So maybe by those measures, it can succeed. But strictly speaking, if I want to maximize how much food this produces in an arid environment, then if I want to maximize and to make it produce as much as, say, a traditional farm, and it's trying to stick to native edibles as much as possible, there's people out there that think that that's impossible. And I can understand where they're coming from. And even if I agree with them, I'm not going to say that it's impossible for permaculture to find that balance, and I'll tell you why. Because in places that are tropical or subtropical, a lot of the foods that grow there, or on the Great Plains, for instance, a lot of the foods that grow there are crops we already eat. They're already crops we depend on, and they grow really easily there and native. So I think in those types of environments, it would be extremely possible, simply growing natives, to have a system that yields just as much as any other agricultural system and is in complete balance with the native environment and has that permanence. That how permanent is your permaculture, that is at least on par with this. When I say permanence, you can be too permanent. Kudzu, edible, but destroys everything that it comes into. It turns everything into kudzu, right? So you don't want that either. So it's an important question to constantly ask every decision you make, whatever it is you're doing in a permaculture system. How permanent is it? How permanent should it be? There's a term I use called naturalized. Some species of plants, when they're in this ecosystem, a dandelion's a good example, they don't overtake any. They don't completely monoculture everything. They don't really interfere with the natural life cycles or growth of any other species, really. They come into stasis with the environment that they invaded. Those species, and of course your native species, is what I would encourage you to use in your permaculture system. Is that is going to give you as much of the permanence that you're going to get. Well, keep in mind, at the very beginning of this, I said even Mother Nature struggles with that permanence because of the invasive species. But take those off the table, and aside from that, would whatever it is you put in, would it survive as well as what you're looking at right now, this native environment, in whatever location you're at, right? You know, if you're in the Arctic or the Great Plains, whatever you put in, could it survive alongside that without your intervention for long periods of time, or maybe even forever? And it's kind of a myth that permaculture requires no ongoing maintenance, that all the maintenance is all up front, and then after that there's no maintenance. There's always maintenance. The aforementioned invasive species will always be something you have to be vigilant against. But if you design your system right, then you can actually reduce that maintenance to very little, to almost nothing. So I think the long-winded, very complicated answer is exactly all of that. You know, it needs to be able to be in stasis with the native environment. It needs to be able to survive on its own without you around. Otherwise, you're not very permanent. You don't have a lot of perma in your permaculture. Is that really a big deal? You know, I don't know. I think it really just depends on what you're trying to do. I mean, I don't have to, for instance, I don't have to, you know, keep these trees alive. You know, I could just take them out. I don't have to, you know, prune them so they're you know, dwarfed down and smaller and allow light in. I could just remove them. So why do I do it? Just because I choose to. So if you don't want to add that permanence, you just want to, you know, take some permaculture techniques, you know, and use them. I don't see any harm in that. But if you're trying to use this native environment around you as your inspiration for permaculture and get as close to that as you can, well then make sure that you always evaluate how permanent what you've done, how long it will stick around without you intervening. Make sure you evaluate that. I think it's important. Why would anyone care what I think?